My name's Chris Jones. I'm one of the tutors on the ALT programme, and you're about to see a short interview with Professor Yrjö Engeström. Yrjö is a professor both at Helsinki University and at San Diego University. He splits his time between the two institutions. He's been a writer, prolific writer over many years now on educational and organisational issues, and he's particularly associated with activity theory. We're going to ask him 5 or 6 questions, which will be shown in short clips following this.
I work in 2 places. I work at the University of Helsinki, where I direct a research center called Center for Activity Theory and Developmental Work Research. And I also work in San Diego at the University of California, San Diego, where I'm at the Department of Communication and also in the Laboratory of Comparative Human Cognition. So I kind of move both geographically between 2 very different countries and cultures, and also between disciplines. So in Helsinki, my home base is education, and more specifically adult education, in terms of the disciplines. And in San Diego, I'm at the Department of Communication, so my professorship there is in communication, which is a rather odd combination. But I think both education and communication as disciplines at their best, they are really multidisciplinary by their very nature. They should actually be at the sort of crossroads of different social sciences and humanities, and sort of bring together the micro and the macro, the agency and structure, the process and the structure, so to speak, and make them speak to each other. So I think that's where I feel that I should be, at such a kind of a boundary, and it's a risky place to be a little bit, because you may end up on no man's land. On the other hand, it's a good place if you can move and cross those boundaries. It's a very good place because you get an audience and you also get ideas in multiple fields.
You mentioned activity theory, which you've been very closely identified with. Could you explain a little about that approach and say something about how it's useful in understanding learning, and in particular learning where it's dealing with new technologies?
Yeah. Well, activity theory, or cultural historical activity theory as its full name is, it was originated in Soviet Russia in the 1920s. The initial father figure was Lev Vygotsky and his close colleagues and disciples, Alexander Luria and Alexei Leontiev. And their agenda was to revolutionize psychology, to go beyond behaviorism and various sort of biologically inspired approaches, to bring in culture into the understanding of human functioning. So to see human beings as culturally mediated, always embedded in some activity which has its own tools and its own language, its own communities. In that sense, I think for me, activity theory in its current stage is very much an approach that tries to radically expand our notion of what is the proper unit of analysis of such processes as learning, for instance. So learning is not limited to what happens underneath the skin of a singular individual, but learning should be understood as, and all cognitive processes should be understood as, something which is distributed between individuals, their colleagues, and their material artifacts, tools, and their semiotic resources, so that you expand the unit of analysis of learning, for instance, and you start to look at who learns in a different way. It's not just the individual, but something like a functioning activity system which learns.
You use the term expansive learning. Can you tell us a little about what that term implies, but also how that differs from standard views of learning?
Yes. It's crucial, I think, that we see learning as a multi-layered phenomenon, that there's not a single explanation of learning. And very useful for me is the work of Gregory Bateson. Bateson distinguishes between learning 1, learning 2, learning 3. Learning 1 being basically conditioning. People, learn to act properly in their environment by being reinforced and sometimes punished for their reactions. And that's often very, incidental, tacit, non-conscious kind of learning. Then he points out that always in this type of learning there is also sort of a secondary layer, which he calls learning 2, which means that we also learn the rules of the game. We not only learn the right answers in school, but we also learn how to become students, for instance. We learn to behave, we learn to acquire character, we learn to cheat, we learn to succeed, etc. We learn all these things which are not in the explicit curriculum. So that would be learning 2. We also learn to experiment with our environments a little bit, to see how much they bend. Can we bend the rules? Can we get away with things, etc. So this type of learning 2 is always embedded in whatever we try to learn. But what is most relevant for my own research is learning 3, and that's what I call expansive learning, or learning by expanding. And that refers to processes where human beings sometimes end up in real contradictory situations in their activity systems, where the demands or messages that are directed at them are conflicting so to an extent that you feel that you're in a double bind. Whatever you do is wrong, that you can't do it right. And in those situations, people sometimes engage in what Bateson would call learning 3. In a sense, they distance themselves from this given context to construct a bigger picture, a bigger context, to expand the context. For instance, a student who is troubled by the conflicting demands in school may be able to distance him or herself to see that, school is actually just a sort of a rather pitiful institution as such, and there's more to life than that. I think that's how, for instance, the radical student movement emerged, that students sort of wanted to go beyond the information given. And learning by expanding, or learning 3, is very much going beyond the information given to construct a new set of criteria, a broader picture, a broader object for your activity, in which it liberates you from the constraints of the particular setting in which you are functioning, and enables you to create new settings. So learning 3, or expansive learning, is very much about learning something which is not yet there, where you learn by constructing a new activity.
Those 3 forms of learning, do you see them as being incremental, as building on each other, or do you see them as combined into an overall activity?
I think what you see is that learning 1 and learning 2 are going on all the time, whether we want it or not. What learning 3 is a fairly rare occasion. We see sort of early beginnings of learning 3 all the time, because they take the form of questioning and deviance. But oftentimes they are thwarted or suppressed. An individual deviant becomes just what the deviant is, namely, marginalized, sometimes stigmatized, sometimes even just basically silenced. As Bateson said, learning 3 is dangerous. People may go crazy, they fall on the wayside, they become coined as weirds, strange people who are not able to function normally. So it's essential. The successful expansive learning requires that you start to create an alliance or a network. The expansion has to be also social expansion. As an individual process, it's too risky and dangerous. You become crazy. The majority will define you as crazy because your notion of what is relevant and right is so radically different from the existing norms that it is very, very essential here that Learning 3, while it's embedded in the normal life, in a sense, like you said, it happens all the time, but it requires very special support and nurturing because, like I said, most commonly you see it being suppressed.
You use the term network, and we've used the term network learning to describe the type of emerging educational system that's developing using new technologies. How do you see activities in education changing in relation to the introduction of network technology?
I see a very sort of two-sided phenomenon. On the one hand, you see this radical immersion and inclusion of that you can actually be immersed and included in a tremendous variety of interactions and potential links to other people and other activities, other cultural resources, and that's the optimistic side of it. At the same time, the logic of the market, the logic of strictly individualist operation in networks is terribly strong at the moment, including education. So there's a lot of pressure toward turning network technologies into just a magnified market mechanism, marketplace, where everybody is for him or herself only. Everybody is just sort of purchasing and perhaps selling something, but there is no community and no genuine, let's say, collaborative effort around producing something. If it's only selling and buying, where's the production of the new? So the risk of these powerful network technologies, I think, is that they tend to commodify, or at least they allow the commodification of knowledge and so on into packages which are bought and sold individually, and to overcome that, or to at least counterbalance that, you need, I think, to pay special attention to issues of creating communities within the networks, so that the nodes of the networks are not just individuals, but also various types of community formations, whether they're virtual communities or actual local communities. And so I think it's very, very important to study not only the sort of market versions of the network, but also, for instance, the open source movement around the Linux, the creation of the Linux operating system is a good example of interesting phenomena where there's genuine community formation also. And you could talk about communities of interest and communities of practice, which in a sense are perhaps new kinds of activity systems, sometimes radically dispersed in time and space, but still sharing an object around which they produce something new, not just consume and exchange. So I think that there is this issue of how do we make sure that these network technologies allow for actual production of the new use values, and how do we make sure that they are not overly individualistically oriented. So go beyond consumption, go beyond just buying and selling, and go beyond the nodes being defined only as individuals. Those are the challenges, and I think it's a very, very exciting field in that sense.
If we gave a time frame to that, what would you see as the major issues in network learning that might emerge over the next 2 or 3 years?
At the moment, I think that technologically speaking, what we see obviously is that probably the radical breakthrough of mobile technologies, which means that the access to the network becomes much more independent of a particular site, so that being from Finland, of course, and seeing what the Nokia is doing with its effort in making the World Wide Web and internet available for everybody in every moment, at every moment. I think that while I think there's a lot of hype, of course, and a lot of perhaps unrealistic expectations there, but there's also a lot that is really happening in the sense of making things more mobile, and this mobility is very, very important, and we're probably not quite aware of its implications in education. For instance, when I look at my son, who is an avid skateboarder, it's a culture of mobility. The skateboarders don't anymore skate just in one place where there's a skate park. They go around the cities and move as nomads, and they call each other, send text messages. In near future, they probably send video showing that here is a nice place to skate. This particular ramp, or this particular way the stairway is built in this building is good for skateboarding, and it means that there is a kind of a coming together and dispersing kind of pulsation socially and informationally, which is a very different notion of network. The network is not anymore just stable nodes in one, which are connected. The nodes themselves move radically, and I think that's a very interesting aspect which we haven't really paid attention to in education. We still think in terms of, okay, here we have the terminals, so let the kids come here at the terminal and start networking. But when the terminals move, that changes. What changes is not quite clear yet.
Finally, the audience of this video is primarily the network learning practitioners and who are developing their work at master's degree level. What would your message for these participants be? If you picked out one thing that you would suggest they think closely about?
Right. I would say, personally, this is just a very personal but also theoretically driven concern of mine, that be aware that network learning, virtual worlds, digital worlds should not be conceived of as closed worlds. In other words, there's a tremendous temptation to think of those networks as complete worlds unto themselves, in which everybody can assume any identity, everybody can play any role, any information is available, etc., etc. You can do anything. However, the connection, the interface to the other world, our physical existence, the fact that we have to eat and walk and live with real people, etc., etc., oftentimes tends to be sort of suspended or nearly excluded. The closed world phenomenon is a real challenge, and I think we need mixed worlds. We need worlds which cross those boundaries and become hybrids. So in a way, I think that in this sense, I'm thinking of, if you think of fantasy, good fantasy books, the Narnia books of C.S. Lewis, they were pretty much Narnia was pretty much a closed world. You had to enter through, a closet, and then you were there. But Harry Potter's world is different, because it's actually, it's in the everyday society. His magician school is a place where they actually have to cross the boundary. And that's, I think, is a good lesson. And we should learn from Harry Potter in that sense, that we should not construct our Narnias. We should construct the magician schools in which you have the trouble of actually facing your parents and dealing with your everyday livelihood and all that stuff, along with those magical possibilities that are offered by the web. So it's both, and it has to be crossbred. In a sense, I'm always asking when people are, for instance, people who talk about the MUDs, multiple user dungeons, or things like that, which captivate their users for days and weeks and totally in a closed world. And I'm asking, so what when the dinner time comes? How do you relate to eating? How do you relate to your body? How is that dealt with, or does that evaporate? Hardly. So I think that we should pay attention to this boundary crossing phenomenon.
Thank you.